Alright guys, so in this video we're going to talk a little bit about what Angular actually is. Now most of you probably know this and have even worked with Angular in some way, but I want this to be a course that someone that has no clue about Angular will be able to follow along with people that have worked with it in the past. So we're going to start from absolute scratch. So what exactly is Angular? It's a front-end or client-side JavaScript framework that was created by and is still maintained by Google, and it's used to build incredibly powerful front-end applications. Front-end meaning that it runs on the client side or on your machine or your browser and not on the server. Now it is possible to run Angular on the server side using something like Universal, but at its core it's a front-end framework. It can be used along with just about any back-end service. It works really well with RESTful APIs. Angular has a really intuitive HTTP component which can be used to easily make requests and get response from a back-end server, which could be built with Node.js or Python, Ruby on Rails, just about any server-side technology. So Angular is also part of the very popular MEAN stack, which stands for MongoDB, Express, Angular, and Node.js. MongoDB is a very powerful and scalable NoSQL database. Express is a backend framework, and Node.js is a JavaScript runtime that uses the Google V8 JavaScript engine. So it's essentially JavaScript on the server. And all of these technologies combined makes for one of the best stacks to build web applications on. Now, the versions of Angular have been very confusing and have even caused many developers to move on to a different framework like React or Vue.js. So I'm going to dedicate the next section to talking briefly about the version history of Angular. But for now, just know that there's Angular.js and there's Angular 2+, which is now just called Angular. And these two are completely different frameworks. So you may already be building applications or websites using vanilla JavaScript. So what are some of the reasons why you'd want to use a framework like Angular? So Angular is great for rapid development or front-end rapid development. It makes things that are incredibly complicated to handle with regular vanilla JavaScript much easier and much more pleasant to work with. So I'm talking about things like routing, HTTP requests, form validation, and the list goes on. This stuff has all been baked into the framework. Not only that, but we have really easy code generation and scaffolding tools with the Angular CLI that we can generate components and services and routes and so on. And if you don't know what any of those things are, don't worry about it. We're going to jump into that soon. So like with any framework, Angular organizes your code very neatly. It breaks functionality up into individual components. For example, your nav bar could be one component, your search bar, blog posts, even the individual blog post could be an encapsulated component. So we can create these components. We can also have services which reach across multiple components by being injected as a dependency. Okay, this makes it so that we don't have to repeat code and we can basically have a single place to do things like HTTP requests and stuff of that nature. Not only is this helpful to you, but it's also helpful to anyone that works with your code. Okay, the Angular framework has often been described as what HTML would have been if it were created for dynamic web applications as opposed to static websites. So we have selectors that can be used as custom tags and attributes, and then we can write dynamic functionality with JavaScript to manipulate what's displayed in the UI. So instead of a static HTML markup page where nothing can change, we have templates where we can have things like variables, expressions, we can have conditionals like if statements and switches, and all these other dynamic concepts which make for really powerful web applications. Okay, it's also completely cross-platform. It doesn't matter if your app is being viewed on Windows, Mac, or Linux, or if it's in Chrome or Firefox, Edge, or any other browser, at least the JavaScript side of things. Design and CSS, that's another story. That's another aspect of your application. All right, and another really nice thing about Angular is its testing capabilities. So unit testing, end-to-end testing, it's all baked into the framework. Now, testing goes beyond this course, so we're not really going to get into it, but just know that Angular makes it much easier to create and run tests. All right, so let's look at some of the core features of Angular. Now, there's a ton of frameworks out there. There's too many to count. React, which is technically a library, but it's still Angular's biggest competitor. You also have Vue.js, Aurelia, and they all have their pros and cons, including Angular. But one thing that you can't argue with is how full-featured Angular is. By default, all of these things come packaged with the initial core framework in CLI. So for React, if you want to use a router, you need to install it separately, or an HTTP client, anything like that. You'll have to use either Fetch or some third-party client. Angular includes all of this stuff by default. And yes, of course, it's going to be a bit more bloated, but it gives you all that you need right off the bat. Okay, and each version of Angular that's been released has become more compact in terms of file size. Now, there may be some words here that are very intimidating, like dependency injection, directives, observables, but don't worry about that. These concepts are not as difficult as you may think, and we're going to learn about them all along the way. Okay, so there's a few different ways to get started with Angular. The most popular and easiest is the CLI, or the command line interface. And this is a tool that we install using NPM, or Node Package Manager, that can quickly generate Angular applications for us. It allows us to quickly generate things like components and services. This is what we'll be using in this course, and this is really the standard in the world of Angular. You also have quick start seeds, which are basically like boilerplate applications. These don't have all of the tools that the CLI has, but they're also relatively easy to set up. Then you have the option to create it from absolute scratch, but there's really no reason to do this, as the CLI creates a complete development environment with a dev server, build tools, and everything that you need. So trying to piece everything together yourself is going to take you 10 times longer, which with much less features, and it'll just make development much harder and longer. All right, and as far as dependencies for Angular, since we're using the CLI, we need NPM, or Node Package Manager, which is a JavaScript package manager, so we can install different things very easily. And you get this with Node.js. So as I said earlier, Node.js is a JavaScript runtime that you can install on your machine. So we will be installing Node.js just so we can use NPM to install the CLI. All right, so that's it. We have one more short slide in this section because I really want to explain the versioning system of Angular, which can be a bit confusing, and then we'll get started. So I will see you in the next lecture.